Forgot to add myself to the stage. Welcome everybody. It feels like it has been a couple weeks since I was on here, but actually it was just a week, little less than a week ago, last Wednesday. Um, Good to be with you all this morning. Make sure to do the basic things and, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Shout out to everybody who subscribed. We did hit 6,000, I think, last night. And so we're over that plateau now, which is a cool uh, measure of progress so far on people checking out the show since we've moved to YouTube in late October or mid October of last year. So thanks to everybody that supports us, that is a patron of the show. There's a link to that in the show notes if you do not do this. And shout out to Eric, shout out to Nadir. Thank you folks for being with us today. So yeah, today is something a little bit different. So, just to give context for this, Josh and I were invited to participate in the Archives Unbound conference, which I think the subtitle was 50 Years of Hope, Resistance, and Rebellion. And the conference itself was about the receipt of the archive of Cedric J. Robinson. Most people just know as Cedric Robinson, right? Whose books you see behind me right now. And Elizabeth Robinson, who I think more people are becoming familiar with. If people went to UCSB or knew Cedric, obviously they knew Elizabeth. But Elizabeth in was I mean, she's still with us, thankfully, and she was at the conference, and it was amazing to meet her, but also to learn about the legacy of her work alongside Cedric, but also independently of Cedric. Incredible legacy of doing internationalists news through a anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist lens, but covering the news, around the world and also locally. It was called Third World News Review, and then there was a program called No Alibis, also both TV in kind of cable access and connected with international organizations and also through the radio, right? So anyway, I just want to say up front, like I was surprised when we were asked. Because I don't actually think that I don't know. I mean, it just is it's an amazing I have so much gratitude that we were asked, right? Like I wouldn't expect to be asked to something that momentous. And the conference itself is fantastic. I have links in the show notes to all of the live streams. Initially, there was some discussion of us recording the whole thing, but that really would have been one. That's not what Josh and I are. We're not really that kind of. We don't have that kind of technical skill, and the people at UCSB, the workers with their I don't know what you call it. We used to call it AV when I was in school, but the people who do the technical work, video, mics, recording, etc. They did a fantastic job, and they are long streams, Eric, and I'll kind of break down some of that and pull out some pieces. I'm going to do a few episodes dedicated to this conference. Some with some video and recordings that I took while I was there. I did not get as much as I would like, and I that was my own fault. I didn't anticipate that the conference would be so moving, that the panels would be so good that I wouldn't want to, sneak away from one or two of them to try to record people. I also um I really didn't anticipate how much of what would make the conference special would be outside of the conference, outside of the formal program, spending time. I mean, Elizabeth Robinson invited, I don't know, 80 of us to her house, right, to have dinner and talk and drink and have fun. And, I think that's like anybody that's ever talked, Josh Myers always talks about this in his book and his discussions, but like anybody's ever talked about the Robinsons talks about that legacy as well and that aspect of what Black studies should be. And that it's one thing to, like, have people say that, but it's totally different to be sort of invited to be a part of it, and so, yeah, I spent most of the time kind of in awe and just talking to different people. I connected with a lot of amazing folks, which I hope to bring many of them on here to have more conversations. Like, a lot of people had to give these, like, 10 to 20-minute presentations on some aspect of Cedric and Elizabeth's work and the meaning that they had to them, and their own work in relation to that, because a lot of people have worked with these archives or further elaborated things that Cedric Robinson was working on. And so that was amazing to see, but I also know that a lot of those things were cut short. And so I would love to have 90-minute 2-hour versions of some of those conversations so that people can hear even more about it. And so I intend to reach out to a lot of the people who were there to try to make that happen, in part to pick up for the fact that I didn't do a great job of doing what I imagined myself to do while I was there, but also just because the work is really amazing. And yeah, I mean, so I think I should say too, like, when I was initially asked, like, I was tremendously humbled by the requests. And I should say Josh unfortunately wasn't able to make it out. There's a lot going on right now, and unfortunately wasn't able to be there. But I wish Josh had been there. It was great. Connected with a lot of folks who have been in study groups too, guests who have been on the show, and and then a lot of people that we definitely will bring out, because again, when you meet people and you can really get a sense of their politics, of everything behind their work, it helps you also understand, like, oh yeah, this is somebody that we should have a conversation with. Sometimes I'll admit that's hard for me to gauge with academics, without really delving into their work, and that takes time, right? And so when you get to meet people, you can see kind of who they are. And the other thing I had some hesitance around is obviously Palestine right now. Like, what would be the orientation of the conference towards Palestine? Would it be this present absence, right? Would it be this thing that's not discussed and engaged? And what does it mean to be in the UC system right now? There's workers on strike in the UC system. They weren't on strike at the campus we were at while we were there, but they did go on strike at the campus this week. So shout out, solidarity to all of the UC Santa Barbara workers. Many of them were there making the conference what it was, which was incredible work, but also just solidarity to them in their strike. And so, yeah, all of that was there. But I would say, like, I was impressed by how present Palestine was within the conversations that people were having, even if, of course, because these are things that people have been working on and studying for years. Most of the conversations were not directly, about, obviously, the struggle in Palestine, but it was present. It was brought up. People that were there are doing their best, right, to organize, support organizing on their campuses, to create spaces for radical movements. And so I was really happy to see that too, even though, of course, there's contradictions. I mean, there was an encampment going on there while we were there. People did go over and say hello and that kind of stuff, but that kind of thing is kind of, it does create some stuff in your mind where you're like, I wish that we could bridge these things even more in some ways than we were able to. But um that aside, so today I'm gonna show a video. So I did record a conversation with Arun Kundnani, who has not been on the podcast before, is the author of What is Anti-Racism and Why Does It Mean Anti-Capitalism, among some other books. Full bio is in the show description. And then Stephen Osuna, who folks probably do know from our work. We've done 3 episodes that feature Stephen. The one on Mao Zedong's, on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. Josh did one with Osuna a couple years ago, on Stephen Osuna's piece on class suicide, which is in the Futures of Black Radicalism collection back there, which is also an excellent book. Not it has some of Cedric's work, but it really is actually, and Elizabeth is in it as well. But it actually is featuring a lot of the folks who were present at that conference, and some amazing people. And again, I have some other couple other interviews that I'll do in subsequent episodes. But um, also I want to just extend the space to a lot of the folks that were there. So look forward to that. There'll be some good conversations coming out of that. Let me pull up my notes. Other things I want to just say quickly is I do want to express sincere thank you to Elizabeth Robinson. um, and I'm sure that I would not have been. I mean, I don't know how or if Elizabeth is really that familiar with my work, but like, I'll give you. So I went up and said hello to her, said, "Hi, I'm Jared," and she said, "Yes, I can see your name tag." um, but she said, "So you're from Millennials, right?" So somebody at least had made that connection for her if she had not, discovered it through maybe the interviews we've done with Josh Myers or um, whatever. But I don't think that I would have been invited if she wasn't okay with it, right? Because I think her hands were all over kind of the decision making around people being there, and so I would thank her for that, but also just for her warmth. And everybody, that's one thing I will say. Usually you go to conferences and like people are a little bit, I don't want to say standoffish, but they're kind of in their own spaces, and maybe they're a little bit full of themselves and not always the most open and gracious. Usually if you compliment them, they are, but like, it's kind of that kind of thing where like in a lot of conferences it's like a little bit of like, "Oh, hey, I enjoy your work." And then it's like, "Oh, cool." Um but this wasn't like that. I mean, as soon as you got there, people were, like, saying hello to you, introducing themselves to you, wanting to find out about you, and I think that was the case for everybody, I feel that way. I felt like there was just a real, generosity from people who all the way down who people who were, like, not participants in the conference, but just went to attend it, students, grad students, um community members, retired folks, but also among all of the scholars, right, that were present there. So, like, again, just really thankful for that. And also I want to say thank you to Charmaine Shua, who I'm sure was, I mean, she's the one who initially asked me to come, and I'm deeply appreciative of that. And to all the grad workers, again, who I believe are all on strike now, solidarity to them in their strike, but thank you to them for just you know, being amazing folks and putting together an amazing event. And yeah, last thing I'll say too is like you couldn't. I encourage people to watch all the panels because there are some really amazing talks, and there's really not. I can't think of any of the talks that I thought, oh, that's just bad, right? Which I should say is unusual. Um, why do I think it was different than others in that respect? I think it has a lot to do with, honestly, and this is something I want to explore a little bit more. Um, that I think it has a lot to do with who Cedric Robinson was and who Elizabeth Robinson still is. And that Erica Edwards has this term that she uses. I can't remember. It's in the end of, I think it's in Futures of Black Radicalism. Um, but she refers to Cedric's people. Um, it might be in the end of Terms of Order. Anyways, it's in one of the pieces she's written with regard to them. And somebody at the end of the conference said, "We're Elizabeth's people," or maybe we should be Elizabeth's people, right? And yeah, so I think that a lot of it had to do with the generosity of spirit of Cedric and Elizabeth Robinson, and how they how they practice that, and how their practice of that then changes people into a space of, at least as an aspiration, wanting to practice that. Like, I don't want to suggest that everybody who's there opens up their house for parties for people to talk politics, all night on a regular basis, and has an open door policy with students from their university and that kind of thing. But I think when you are mentored by people who embody that kind of practice, that it certainly creates an aspiration for you to, to express that. And so I think that's probably why it was different. And I should say, like, I've been to some other kind of similar, like, I was there when Angela Davis's archives were received by Harvard. And that was an amazing event with amazing talks. But that was not an event where when you left for the day, like at that one, you left for the day, or at least we did, and um, there wasn't this kind of community aspect. Part of that is because, of course, Angela Davis didn't go to Harvard and didn't live in Cambridge, right? And neither did most of the people who were there, right? So like that was part of it. But um, yeah, so I would say that was part of what it was different. Um, Yeah, India, we will definitely be bringing some of the folks through. So before I go further, because I don't want to take up too much time with me blathering up front, I'm gonna play a video. So this is an interview. I mentioned I hosted a quick interview. Um, Shout out. Hang on one second. I do have to give a shout out before I play this. So this was an interview with Arun Kundnani and Stephen Osuna, as I mentioned earlier. Shout out to Gary Colmenar, who is an awesome librarian at UCSB, who I actually want to have conversation with. Gary lent me his office to be able to conduct this interview, which was one of the challenging things. Is like, where and how do I interview people as a podcaster in this space, and so shout out to Gary for helping me out with that. But also, a lot of people were like, he's the coolest librarian I know. So anyways, I'm interested in learning more about Gary. Um, but yeah, and as far as reading Black Marxism, we're gonna talk a little bit about that today, and we'll do a little more discussion of that. Um, but funnily, Elizabeth actually said at some point that she's kind of over Black Marxism, over people talking so much about Black Marxism, and wants people to read Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, which is over my shoulder there. So we'll get into some of that too, because this is one of the tensions, and we're discussing it a little bit in this video that I'm about to play, is the tension between Black Marxism as a text, um, the way that racial capitalism as a term has become kind of what I would talk about is the elite capture of the term racial capitalism, and probably the elite capture of the term the Black radical tradition as well. And which is to say that these terms are used so often in such diffuse ways that are not that deeply connected to Cedric's work. And Cedric didn't spend a tremendous amount of time elaborating them as like um, political economic kind of concepts, or spending time really talking about how these analytics or these concepts function in certain ways. I mean, he certainly does say some important things about them. Um, and so yeah, we'll discuss that more. But part of this interview actually is Stephen Osuna, who is one of the one of the mentees of Cedric Robinson, but also William Robinson. And William Robinson wrote a criticism of Black Marxism, calling it a proto-Afro pessimist text, and saying a bunch of other things about it. And so Stephen, interestingly, is mentored by both of these people, and he's responding to that. He responded to the criticism in his video, um, which, if we have time, I may pull it up. If not, people can watch it. But we'll see how, if people want me to play it, maybe I'll play it at the end. In his panel, right? He addressed it. And then Arun, because his work is about racism and capitalism also, and his presentation was about these things. So I wanted to put the two of them kind of in conversation to have this discussion a little bit, because one of the discussions is that people people like to have as increasingly in recent years, people have wanted to pit Cedric Robinson against Marx or against Marxism. And there is a critique of Marxism that is embedded in Robinson's work, both in Black Marxism and in the anthropology of Marxism, um, that I think we need to engage with more deeply and determine, how do we feel about that critique? How do we feel about, are there areas where we think it's correct? Is it incorrect? Right? You should engage with critique. It's not a but as Josh Myers has said, it's not a dismissal, and I will say this, like, I don't think there was a single person there that I encountered at this conference that would be like, "Oh, yeah, like, fuck Karl Marx," like, or a an anti-Marxist, like, the people that were there were, like, all very much like that I draw things from that the history of doing critical political economy and many things from the Marxist tradition in the work that I do, and I also draw things from the work of Cedric Robinson, and those are both important to my work, and I didn't find anybody that was like you know uh, expressing what I would call anti-Marxist views at to a person at the conference in terms of folks that I talk to. So that's interesting too, right? And yeah, we can get into that more. I'll also take some questions at the end if folks have them. So feel free to drop questions in the chat. But I'm gonna get to this video because I'm talking too much already. All right, hang on. I will say quickly, they're smiling because this was take 3, and, they're laughing at me for that, and the camera work on this is also not great. I use this camera that, like, readjusts itself from AI, and, it's a little blurry in spots and, like, jumps around a little bit, so I'm still getting used to that. So anyways, apologize for the technical aspects of that. Alright, so folks are saying there's no sound. Was there no sound on the video as you were listening to it or as I was playing it there? Alright, that stinks. Let me see, how do I do that? Alright, let me try to play it with me on the screen too and see if that makes a difference. Can folks hear the video or just hear me? Alright, well, that stinks, but I will be able to work around that. I'll have to actually upload the video to YouTube. Let me see, I wonder if I can even do that while I'm trying. So I'm gonna try to do that. I'm gonna try to upload it right now, and, I'll say a few more things, and then if I can, then I'll be able to play it from the profile. So sorry about that, folks. I thought it would play, but YouTube's kind of weird about some of that stuff. All right. So while I'm doing that, while it's uploading, let me just lay out a little bit of. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I know what it'll do. I'll play you all Stephen Osuna's presentation from the event itself, all right? And then what I will do is come back to, I'll upload the video while I'm doing that, um, and then from there, we will get to the other aspects of the video, so apologies for the technical stuff, folks. Um, not that one. Alright, I got it. Alright. Apologies for that, folks. Here we go. So this is gonna be Stephen Osuna's talk, which, is great, and will give you context also for the interview that we have, so that's helpful.
All right, great. First of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you for the organizers. I really appreciate this. And Elizabeth, thank you. Thank you so much. So, while reflecting on the 20th anniversary of the Third World News Report in 2005, Elizabeth Robinson states, and Robin Kelly said this yesterday, quote, "We do not speak of the global South because we recognize the Third World as a condition, not a place." Through the Third World News Report, Elizabeth and Cedric Robinson, joined by an ensemble of guerrilla intellectuals from UCSB and the Santa Barbara community, reported on the international conditions that Robinson described as Third World. These conditions were not specific to a region or place, rather, they were the ongoing social struggles shaped by the geographies of racial capitalism and imperialism. Their news show, launched by Cedric Robinson and Corey Dubin in 1980 on the campus and community radio station KCSB, and eventually local public television, served as a corrective to corporate media and the US State Department's narrative of global affairs. More importantly, the Third World News Report reported on what was often concealed in mainstream news, a political project that Cedric and Elizabeth took very seriously. Their coverage of social conditions was not just focused on the region we often think of as Third World, since Elizabeth notes, quote, "The Third World exists in Los Angeles, Detroit, London, Marseilles, and other parts of the First World." For them, the Third World was a site where the oppressed and exploited made history. And while it was not under the conditions of their choosing, they remind us the masses are the true agents of this history. Elizabeth's reflections of the Third World News Report and the Third World as a condition is instructive for our current discussion of anti-imperialist internationalism and international solidarity. In these comments, I revisit three key texts by Cedric and Elizabeth that provide us with a model of how to think through an anti-imperialist internationalist perspective that keeps the social struggles of the Third World at the center rather than the margins. While recent interest in Cedric Robinson's scholarship is welcome, since he deserves his flowers, we must resist the attempts to sanitize his work and political commitments. We must challenge misinterpretations, lazy readings, and unprincipled critiques that blame his work for the failures of political organization and leftist movements in the US and the backlash by forces of reaction. A mentor and comrade of mine, with his co-writers, mistakenly called Robinson's Black Marxism a, quote, proto-Afro-pessimistic text par excellence, unquote. This reading claims Robinson was anti-Marxist and fundamentally anti-socialist. On the other hand, Robinson's analysis of racial capitalism has been used as a placeholder to avoid a deeper critique of the intimate relationships between racialism and political economy. Just mention racial capitalism and there's no need for a materialist analysis, which leads to the simplistic analysis of, quote, black and brown people poor, white people rich. Robinson's analysis of racial capitalism and politics were much more than this, as Elizabeth describes in her interview conducted by Christina Heatherton and Jordan Camp. Quote, I see race mentioned more than class. Racism is a moving concept. It appears when class interests become threatened. That's really hard for things to grasp for a lot of people, that racism is not about color, unquote. While framing the third world and the first world has been used by liberals and forces of reaction to racialize and exceptionalize impoverished conditions or suggest that the fascist assaults like the January 6th riot at the Capitol are only supposed to happen in third world countries, Robinson emphasizes that social relations of oppression, exploitation, and uneven development. It is an application of her and Cedric's internationalist perspective. If we look at Los Angeles through this optic, for example, a city that I've lived in most of my life, a city that enlivens me and brings me to tears, and where a lot of my writing and research is based on, the third world has a stark presence. The transnational migration and settlings of people from global south countries, the translocality of violence that the agents of the capitalist state, such as the police and social workers, enact on working class and the poor, the uneven development of gentrification and unhoused encampments, all these conditions and social relations are shaped by a racialized global political economy that has no borders and produces the third world in one of the top 6 richest cities in the world. Between 2013 and 2023, millionaires in Los Angeles saw their wealth expand by 45%, while in 2022, a quarter of the 15-year-olds in LA lived below the poverty line. These political and economic realities are present in much of Cedric and Elizabeth's work. They were able to grasp the global in the local. In his 1993 essay, Race, Capitalism, and the Anti-Democracy, Robinson begins in Los Angeles by way of the beating of Rodney Glenn King by the Los Angeles Police Department. He notes the terror enacted on King was backed by law, corporate power, and nurtured by the perverse soul of Western civilization. While beginning with the King beating, Robinson soon expands to the international conjuncture. Only 2 months prior to King facing a pavement lynching, the US, with 42 country coalition, including such countries such as Honduras and the Philippines, invaded Iraq. Robinson argues the policing forced on King microcosmically rehearsed the, quote, desert slaughter of the Iraqi masses, which leaders of the most powerful Western Christian civilized nation had initiated and choreographed only a few months earlier, unquote. In both instances, Robinson argues, the dominant class in their fevered imagination argued, quote, the hard descending upon the inferior was deserved, unquote. From the violence of the LAPD and US imperialism in Iraq, Robinson follows by describing the domestic and national political extremism of the Reagan and Bush administrations. From the invasion and counterinsurgency wars in Grenada, Lebanon, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Panama, Iraq, and the streets and courts of every American city, these right-wing governments were upheld by a, quote, debauchery of unfettered capitalism and political and bureaucratic corruption, unquote. In the Reagan administration, this was experienced through a multi-trillion-dollar national debt while billions were cut from the social wage, the savings and loan crisis, and the Iran-Contra scandal. During this period, the wealthiest 1% of families increased their after-tax income by 60%, while the poorest 40% experienced income loss. During the Bush administration, deregulation gutted the Departments of Labor, Housing, and Urban Development and Education, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and the Environmental Protection Agency. This was the national and international context of the brutalization of King. Robinson's deep dive in the Bush and Reagan administration is important to understand what happened to King and what would come next. As Robinson notes, quote, though embedded in a racial narrative, the vigilantism of Rodney King's violations extend beyond the political and ideological economies of Black oppression, unquote. Race, Robinson argues, is a signature of the American empire, but only one aspect of its nature. Given the racial constructions of government reports, official statistics, US journalism, and the common sense of everyday life, the public perception of the stratified society of the US was, quote, fashioned through a racial screen, unquote. Robinson describes that while Black men were imprisoned by the US at a rate 4 times that of South Africa, it was also the case that 1.2 million white men and women were imprisoned in 1990. He notes that even if all Blacks in the US were poor, one half of the American poor would still be unaccounted for. Here, Robinson was referring to the absent poor white, which he always loved to bring up in seminars. You were in Santa Barbara, where are the poor whites? And we'd always be like, they're in prison. And he'd laugh, right? Typically like Robinson. Rhetorically, Robinson argues, quote, in the American empire, the stigmata of poverty, the deviance of crime, and much of the political responsibilities of critical dissent have been transferred to Black and other natives. In this essay, Robinson suggests that while racial constructions were used to justify the assault on King, they were only subterfuges to mask the multiple assaults by the ruling class, the historical sources of anti-democratic extremism, the historical and structural forces that shaped the King beating and the racialized discourse surrounding it were neither psychological nor cultural. All the nastiness of racist elites and their politicians, police, and journalists were, quote, surface idioms rather than the profound objectives, unquote. Race was foregrounded by reaction, Robinson notes, but inevitably they would inspire their own contradictions. The LA rebellion in April 29th, 1992 would be a coalescence of the betrayed, Black, brown, and white. Robinson quotes Thomas Rainborough from the 17th century, quote, either poverty must use democracy to destroy the power of property, or property and fear of poverty will destroy democracy. This, Robinson argues, is the fundamental opposition that must be concealed. In a 1999 essay titled On Los Angeles Times, Crack Cocaine, and the Rampart Division Scandal, Robinson would return to a local LA policing concern and globalize it. The Rampart scandal was the unearthing of a long history of LAPD misconduct and corruption in its Rampart Division and its crash unit, which stood for Community Resource Against Street Hoodlums, near downtown LA. If no one's ever heard of it, street hoodlums. Yeah. Yeah. They policed the neighborhood that I grew up in. So I saw a lot of what they're talking about, right? I was a witness to this violence work that Rampart outlaws, as Robinson called them, described happened. The scandal involved police shootings, evidence planting, false arrests, witness intimidation, beatings, theft, drug dealing, prostitution, and perjury. Robinson berates the Los Angeles Times for their counterinsurgent reporting of this historical case of police misconduct. He was not surprised, however, since in 1996, they had dismissed, discredited, and attacked San Jose Mercury News reporter Gary Webb's investigation of the CIA's involvement in the cocaine epidemic that hit Los Angeles in the 70s and 80s. And in 1985, mishandled reporting of the laundering of millions of dollars of drug money by Bank of America. All these stories, Robinson's notes, share a common theme of drugs, law enforcement, and Central America. Subjects, Robinson argues, the Times frequently flounders. Instead of providing the backdrop of the Rampart scandal, the Times, through a quote-unquote face-saving journalistic gesture, participated in the good old-fashioned propaganda. In one article analyzed by Robinson titled, "In Rampart, Support is Strong," he describes how the journalists highlight positive perceptions of the LAPD among residents of the Rampart Division. He notes, quote, perjury, drug dealing, onward shootings were obscured now by the muscular slogan, aggressive policing. The following article, Robinson critically reads, crime, poverty, test Rampart's officers' skills. He contends that the reporting absolves police from their misconduct through a, quote, savagehood narrative that makes people with problems the problem, as George Lipsitz would always say. While the article interviews residents, all immigrants and refugees from Mexico and Central America, it occludes the, quote, histories of national violation and forced evacuation, unquote, and suggests individual responsibility for the movements across national borders. However, Robinson makes it clear that these migrants and refugees are, quote, human documents of American foreign policy in Central America. In this essay, Robinson applies his third world internationalist perspective by arguing the victims of Rampart scandal were victims of US imperialism first and foremost. While the Times justified police misbehavior, they also concealed the history of US counterinsurgency and drug wars in Central America. In his amazing humor, Robinson ends the article with, quote, apparently around Mulholland Drive, cocaine is a supplement for creativity. At Pico Union, it merely fertilizes the jungle. Cedric and Elizabeth co-authored an essay in 2013 titled Ferguson, Gaza, Iraq, an outline on the official narrative in post-racial America. The essay describes the legitimacy crisis of the official narrative of the Ferguson Police Department's murder of Michael Brown, the Israeli state's ongoing genocide in Gaza, and US foreign policy in the Middle East. They explain how the narratives of these horrific displays of state terror were constantly contradicted by actual images of these war zones. As the Robinsons describe, as Robinson describes racial regimes and forgeries of memory and meaning, the official narratives of Ferguson, Gaza, and Iraq were contrivances and untenable. While masked in post-racial construction shaped by a neoliberal racial regime, race projects like the war on drugs were reversing the achievements of previous freedom movements. These race projects not only depict Black youth like Brown as deviant, they expanded to include whole countries like Iraq and Central American refugee youth as terrorist threats. While these race projects are deployed against the masses, the Robinsons remind us that they are an artifice. Ferguson, they argue, quote, is about poverty and the links to which the state and its local tributaries have gone to control the poor, unquote. More importantly, they argue, race and racism are merely covers for class. While this might be read as class reductionist, it is far from it. It is what I believe racial capitalism has always meant, the way race becomes a way of transnationally controlling labor and surplus populations. This analysis is fundamental to the Robinson's third world internationalism, a preferential option for the poor by uplifting the conditions they face, but more importantly, the alternatives that exist within those conditions and the struggles of resistance against them. In Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson argues, quote, Marxists have often argued that national liberation movements in the third world are secondary to the interests of the industrial proletariat and the capitalist metropoles, or that they need to be understood only as a social efflux of world capitalism, unquote. We still face this class essentialism by a sector of the Western Marxists, a form of economism, as J. Mafwad Paul argues. However, our third world internationalism must combat this tendency. While Robinson's intentions were not to slightly stretch Marxism, but rather provide a ruthless criticism of it, I believe for those of us who do take up the task of expanding the Marxist tradition to address the ravages of racial capitalism, Robinson's scholarship is a necessity. Avery Gordon claims while critiquing historical materialism and Black Marxism, Robinson practiced a sort of historical materialism that was grounded in the primacy of social struggle. As Antonio Gramsci notes in The Revolution Against Capital, quote, the laws of historical materialism are not as set in stone as one might think, unquote. So to return to the Third World News Report, Elizabeth Robinson describes it, as Shireen shared earlier, as the proverbial mosquito on the elephant's behind, since the broadcast was only heard by a few 100,000 people. Yet, she reminds us, we must always remember that the resistance starts with tiny bits which nourish imagination and audacity. May our international solidarity be the tiny bits which nourish imagination and audacity, that nourish a historical materialist analysis of concrete conditions, and may we be audacious in serving the people. Long live international solidarity. Long live the Palestinians and their struggle for survival and their resistance in all its forms. Cedric Robinson, presente. Thank you.
All right, that's great. So I should say a couple things. One of the things that was done with the audio, which is a good thing, but you can't hear like clapping, like you heard a little bit of it at the end, but you can't really hear how much applause there was. Also, you can't hear as much when people are like laughing or responding as the speakers saying, and that's just because the mics were set up in such a way that they were like just picking up barely at times, but they were designed to pick up the voices of the person speaking and not to pick up audience sound so that it would be clearer, which is a good thing for the quality of the audio, but it can make it look like some of the panels just kind of fell flat. I can tell you like that that one had pretty close to a standing ovation, right? And some of them did, and so just wanted to share that it was a well received thing, if it didn't look like it was. Um, I'm not gonna play Arun's conversation today, but I may do it another time. It's also a very good one. It's on day 2. If people wanna look for it, I can tell you it's on day 2. It's in that first panel, which also included Moten and Harney, um, and it included, I don't have it pulled up, but some other folks too. It was a really good one, so I encourage people to really watch that one. I mean, I encourage people to watch all of them, but I hear Francis's comment in terms of they are very long, and so yeah, we'll go through and pull some different ones out to share pieces as we do these episodes. Um, but did wanna say that. So I will play now Arun's conversation with Steven, which I uploaded to. It's also a separate file now on our YouTube page, but let me see. Full screen. All right. And it says Jared Ware in the bottom left corner, and that's just because I don't know how to use equipment. But all right. Let me play this. All right. So I'm here at the Archives Unbound conference with Arun Kundnani and Stephen Osuna. And we're going to reflect on some of the points that they brought up in their discussions at the panels that they were a part of. Obviously, this conference is in celebration of the receipt of Cedric Robinson and Elizabeth Robinson's archives by UCSB, where they worked for decades. And so, Stephen, I wanted to start with you. So I know that, as we've talked about over the years, that Cedric is a very, critical mentor for you. And Bill Robinson also is an important mentor to you, and so in many ways they've each given you tools that you use in your own work. And obviously many people will know, if not, they can look it up. Bill wrote a piece that was quite critical of Black Marxism and, Cedric's work in a lot of ways. And, you've shared with me before, I think we've even discussed this slightly on the pod probably at some point, but you disagree with the critique. And, you responded to that yesterday in your discussion. And so I wanted just to talk a little bit about that, about obviously they both influence you methodologically and in terms of the tools that you bring, even in responding. And the other piece with that is, I kind of wanted you to share a little bit of kind of the making of that talk for you, which is, how did you choose the way that you wanted to respond, or what work of Cedric's you wanted to use in kind of responding to Bill's critiques?
Sure. Thanks for the interview. I think for me, again, like as you mentioned, I was here in Santa Barbara and I studied under William Robinson and also worked with Cedric, right? And both of them were influential in many ways. Influential in trying to understand race and class and understanding, political economy and the history of white supremacy within political economy and outside political economy. And so I think, yesterday's talk and my comments really were trying to show how, the critique of Cedric, and in the article you mentioned, the comment is that Cedric's Black Marxism is a proto-Afro-pessimist piece, right? And for me, that's far from the truth, right? To me, if you read it and you read his work, all the work that he's done in relationship to Black Marxism, you see that it's far from the truth that it's Afro-pessimist. I think it's more showing us the history of social struggle, the history of international solidarity in the work that he does, and so in the work that I was putting out of the 3 pieces I covered in the talk that I gave, I was trying to show that example, right? The example that Cedric not only was providing in his own way a historical materialist analysis of things, but he was also trying to show that that the way race covers class issues, but more so than that, covers the history of solidarity within groups, right? And so, like, for example, I bring up the article about the Rodney King beating and how the ruling classes, siege on the masses in LA and in the United States throughout the 80s and early 90s, it gets revealed with the LA uprisings, LA riots in 82, and how, the media at that moment was trying to cover it as a black issue, that this was a black riot. But if you actually look at the media, if you look at what was going on the ground, it was far from that, right? You had Central American refugees rioting, you had working class folks rioting, you had black folks rioting, right? So it really revealed the falsity and the fabricated idea of race in his work. And Cedric was mentioning that in that piece, right? I described the idea of when he's talking about the Rampart scandal in the late 90s of the LAPD, again, revealing that the constructions of race, when you start actually looking at what's happening on the ground, they are what they are, constructions to hide, to mask the political, economic, structural conditions, right? Of multiple groups, right? Of different issues. Of, again, that moment of the Rampart scandal, we look at him understanding that this is an issue of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. imperialism beyond just the LAPD and its relationship to them, right? And so for me, and others that I covered in that talk, but again, my response to the piece that my mentor and comrade William Robinson wrote was to show that this is far from Afro-pessimist, right? That Cedric's ideas of solidarity and internationalism have been through history in his work, right? And it's have been there, right? And the idea that his work might be race essentialist is, again, far from the truth. If you look at his actual work, he's trying to challenge the essentialism of what capitalism does, right? Of what the history of capitalism shows us with race, right? And so there's some things that I was trying to work through, right? Again, the work of William Robinson has been inspirational for me thinking about global capitalism, the role of capital in Central America, right? So for me, it's like I combine both of their works in the stuff I do, and you can see it in my writing, right? So it came as a surprise when that piece was written, right? More so because, if it's a critique of a cult of Cedric Robinson, then I guess I'm in that cult, right? But again, that in itself, those words, right? Afro-pessimist, a cult, is something that we could need to combat. There's not that. It's actually how has his work, as Arun was saying, how do we use his work for struggle, to understand struggle, right? And for me, his work really just helps us understand struggle, right? And more so the importance of solidarity in building struggle. I think for me, that's what's been really generative in the work I do. Also with the stuff I've been part of organizations, with what I teach my students, right? Thinking about the role of solidarity and internationalism. And again, I see that wholeheartedly in his work, right?
Right on. And Arun, I mean, part of the reason I put the two of you in conversation is because I think you're both grappling with these critiques in some ways of Robinson, but also, as you said in your piece, and Stephen, or in your talk, and Stephen alluded to it there too, is it's like, better for people who are interested in struggle and for organizing. Better question for us is, are there tools that we can use within these frameworks, right? I mean, and that's the only importance of Marxism too, really. Are there tools? And that's a part of why I see, Marxism has been taken up in different ways and applied all over the world based on analyses of the conditions locally and, in ways that Marx couldn't have possibly imagined himself, because he had no way to analyze all of those situations and, struggles. In talking about racial regimes today, which I think is one of the areas, Elizabeth Robinson today said, she's like, I think we've talked enough about Black Marxism in some way, and I would like people to really look at forgeries of memory and meaning and racial regimes. And you talked about racial regimes and how Cedric describes them, and I'm very much paraphrasing here, so feel free to correct, but essentially that there is obviously a process that comes from above, from the ruling class, in kind of articulating and re-articulating these regimes in different ways, sometimes contradictory ways, from one era to the next, as they seek to use them to their own ends. And also in Robinson's work, there is, which goes back through Black Marxism, but shows up in forgeries as well, this critique of the long history of racism embedded deep within Western culture, the bowels, as it says, right? So I see that in my own vantage and kind of reading that as a kind of dialectical process where culture is something that is constantly, it is inherited, but it is also constantly recreated, co-created. And it is also something that rulers are throughout time, are very thoughtful in, okay, how can we use aspects of this to our own advantage to maintain our power, etc. So yeah, could you talk a little bit about that relationship from your vantage point, and anything that, you want to kind of add on to what Stephen has said, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Like you say, for me, the way I come at this is what can we use here, right, as tools in our liberation struggle, right? And talking about these texts is about sharpening those tools, right? And because anyone who produces like a very rich body of work, like Cedric Robinson did, there's going to be different bits you can pull out of it that will point in different directions, right? And because of that, you can go to Black Marxism, and if you're looking for it, you can find the sentences that will say something like, the white supremacy, or actually more accurately racialism, to use his term, right? Racialism is just something that's been there in Western culture, going way back to way before capitalism, right? And that capitalism is a mediation of that pre-existing racist culture, right? So when you talk about racial capitalism, the way you would interpret it on this way of thinking is, like, of course, once capitalism comes along, because you've got this pre-existing racist culture, the capitalism is just going to express that, right? So, and in that way, you can kind of, there's something in that can lead you to Afro-pessimism, right? It looks a lot like Afro-pessimism if you do that reading. I don't think that's something that you can do to Black Marxism unless you do distort it in ways that put it, that you're deliberately misreading huge chunks of that book, right? But then you look at a book like Forgeries, right, which was it 2007, right? More than 2 decades later, right? And he puts it very clearly, right, in the opening of that book, that there is no permanent kind of underlying fixed kind of racial structure to Western culture. It's something that's highly unstable, right? Because you're talking about, it's like a forgery. It's a myth. It's a lie, right? It's trying to imagine that these things we call races are these kind of natural ordering things in the world, right? And because that's what race is always about. Race is about naturalizing and dehistoricizing inequalities. Right? That's what it's always been. And so therefore, because from, for however far back you want to go, we've always been struggling to undo that naturalization, right? We've always been trying to break apart these systems that are organized through this idea that these are just fixed inequalities that can't be changed because they're just written into nature, right? We've always been trying to, and so every time we break it up, we're in this constant struggle. They're trying to rebuild it in new ways, right? New ways, not just keeping it the same, new ways. They have to keep it changing to keep it the same, right? That's the sort of paradox that's at the heart of this, right? So that's what we need. That's what racial regimes is about. That's what Cedric's onto when he's talking about that, right? And that's politically important because, of course, unless we can imagine these things falling apart, what are we even struggling about, right? Like if we think that the basic problem with Afro-pessimism and every other kind of pessimism about these kind of structures is that it tells us we can't win in our struggles, right? But we can, right? If you kind of know anything about the history of our struggles, you know that we're always opening up possibilities for victory, right? We can taste it, right? So that's why we need to bring in, if we're talking about Cedric's work, we need to give a lot more prominence to forgeries than we normally do. We need to give a lot more prominence to the piece on Los Angeles that Steve was just talking about. A huge amount of stuff there that would just give us a much more effective reading of what Cedric was about, right?
Absolutely. I think do you have anything anything you want to say in response? Or
No, I go back to you're describing the importance like of the Marxism, right? And again, for me, some people, again, another aspect of that reading is that Cedric, because of the way he's read, that he's anti-Marxist. And unfortunately, I've met people that do read him, and then they're like, "Yeah, I'm not going to read Marx because I already read Cedric," and he said, "It's why read Marx." And again, that's just a lazy reading, right? It's a lazy reading of all the other work, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, the appropriation of Frantz Fanon in Race and Class, that piece right there. It's a really great piece where you could see his analysis of the petty bourgeois, right? And the way that people get appropriated and not understand class interests, right? And so me, again, he's engaging Marxism. And one thing I said yesterday is like, Cedric's project wasn't about stretching Marxism, like Fanon said, right? It was about a ruthless criticism of Marxism, right? But for me, that amplifies and improves how I understand Marxism, right? For me, that's what it was in my time studying here in Santa Barbara. It was about really engaging Marxism through Bill Robinson, again, working with Bill, but then also we were looking at the blind spots of our Marxism through Cedric, right? So those two things were my go-to, my ability to understand that and understand the context of what I study, the context of the reality that I grew up in LA, right? My experience in Mexico and El Salvador, right? All those things, my trips to Cuba now, these things have really shaped my understanding of that, keeping those two concepts in conversation, the tension that exists there, right? And thinking about political economy and the material conditions, but also the things that might be blinded by that analysis, right? And so I think, again, as someone that I said at the end, as someone that wants to uphold the Marxist tradition and believes in the Marxist tradition, it's how do we improve it? How do we strengthen it? And I think Cedric Robinson's work is important for that, right? It's not about a dismissal. It's about how do we amplify it,
And also, I think also on this question, so if you read Black Marxism just with a little bit of care, right, it's obvious that he's talking about. So he sets up the book as a meeting between what he calls the Black radical tradition and Marxism, right? And he's pretty much everything in that book that he's doing is trying to think about what does that meeting look like, right? What's going on in that meeting place, and the bits where he's critical of Marxism, which is, as you say, it's a ruthless critique, but he's actually not referring to it necessarily all the time as Marxism, right? Sometimes he's saying Marx is Leninism,
yeah.
Marx, there's all kinds of ways in which it's a little bit more subtle than just here's this thing called Marxism that's this one thing, right? It's like, obviously Cedric's well aware that there's a huge tapestry of movements that might be thought of as Marxist movements around the world, right? And of course, what we always do, right, whatever your relationship is to that tradition, right, you call yourself a Marxist or not, but if you're involved in some kind of radical liberation politics, always, of course, what you do is questioning your working assumptions, right, that you've inherited from the past about how you understand the world. You always question, right? That's our duty. Each new generation has to do that because the world is changing as well, right? We can't just fight the system now using the tools from, even 50 years ago, let alone 19th century when Marx is writing, right? That's before we even start to think about what does his positioning in Europe mean and so on, right? Of course, we're going to criticize, right? But we, the fact of the matter is we can't entirely escape the paradigm of Marxism either, right? Like, I mean, they've been writing about the death of Marxism since he was alive, right? But somehow it still seems to be something that people need to use, right? And I mean use, not just like quote off in a mechanical way, but use it, right? Try it out, see if it applies to the world, see if it works for the struggles you're engaged in. If it does, great. If it doesn't, adapt it, stretch it, rework it entirely. Right, that's what we're always doing, right? That's how we work.
I think that's right, and I think it reminds me too when you read Black Marxism. I mean, I think the main point I would say is like that, as for instance, you look at the third section, when he's dealing with Du Bois, CLR, and Richard Wright, it's very much a kind of set of examples of how the taking of certain positions brought people in and pushed people out of these movements,
right?
Based often on how they articulated around questions of race and national questions,
right?
And obviously we could, he even said this towards the end, is that he wished he had tackled the question of gender more in relation to that work. But yeah, I mean, so it is I think that point of critique, is really important. And, it's actually, share one thing. There's a friend of mine, Justin Lang, who's a organizer in Pittsburgh. And when we did a study group of Black Marxism, one of the things he proposed is, he said, maybe Black Marxism is not such a misnomer for this text as is sometimes stated. He said, maybe what Black Marxism is a methodological approach. It's not saying that it is Black Marxism, right? But it is like, what would a Black Marxism be? And that in that, Cedric is bringing in the ontological, the cultural, the racial, and the national, and putting these things into tension and conversation with the political, economic, and the historical material, in a way that often is not done within, I won't say all, but as well as the masses, right? And what are the masses doing, and what are they thinking about, the importance of their ideas and the ways that they struggle. These are things that, as he kind of critiques, are left out sometimes when you just do political economy, through a kind of Marxist, analysis. Yeah.
I mean, I think, I think there is a problem of a certain kind of Marxism, right? That is more prevalent in Europe and the United States and the rest of the world, right? That doesn't handle those questions that you were just talking about, the cultural and so on, right? Doesn't handle them very well, right? And so, that's an ongoing question, an ongoing debate, an ongoing struggle, right, around that stuff. There's a tendency for a certain kind of Marxism in the United States to just feel very threatened by bringing in these other questions around race and culture, right? Like, we're diluting some purity of how I understand the system, right? The reality is most of the people who've been Marxist thinkers and organizers and movement people around the world haven't thought like that, right? Like, most Marxism happens outside of Europe and the United States, and it always has done, right, since the beginning of the 20th century, right? So, if you look at it that way, then we don't want to get too hung up on, on this particular way of thinking that a few people in Brooklyn have, right? Like, actually, there's a bigger world out there, right? That this is just normal to think about Marxism like this, right? Of where our struggles are always in and through culture, right? That's just how we always have been, right? And the question of, I mean, you don't have to get out of the like Lenin's talking about racism, right? Like Lenin, like he's got an analysis of anti-racism as what you could say what Lenin's talking about when he's talking about the Black struggle in the United States is an intersectional analysis where he's linking race and class, right? That isn't something that happens post 1960s in that particular line of Marxist thinking. That happens in 1920 and 1916 and 17, right? So I just don't buy this idea that like, here's this thing called Marxism, right? And it's what is defined in this very narrow way by by a very narrow particular tradition of how people think about Marxism in the United States or in London or wherever,
Right on. Well, thank you both. This has been great. Really appreciate it. Okay. All right. I hope folks enjoyed that conversation. So first I want to say to Arun's like final, I gotta take that banner down. Final comments there. That I agree with what he says too. I mean, this is something that Ruthie Wilson Gilmore says too, is like, most Marxists are not white, they're not men, and they don't live in Europe or the US, right? And so I think that's always, and that has been the case for a very long time, right? And so I think that's something also to remember, of that even the the formulation that I proposed was a little bit problematic, right? To say that um, it's just Robinson who offers this kind of methodology that considers these other questions, um, when Cabral was thinking about this stuff, right? We could go on and talk about all the interventions. I mean, it's interesting. Like there was a lot of discussion, and I want to do a follow up discussion on this of Robinson's work around the peasantry as often, perhaps most often, um, the kind of agents of history, right, in historical revolutionary struggles. And I want to dig into that, see what he's talking about, what examples he uses. But again, this is part of what, if you get to anthropology of Marxism and even think through some of his work within Black Marxism, part of what he's attending to too is like that the way that Marxism was originally proposed within Europe, that there were certain assumptions, right, around who the agents of history would be, the industrial proletariat, for example, right? And that has not, I'll just say that has not always been the case. It certainly has not led to a successful socialist or communist revolution within Western Europe or the United States. And Western Europe is where, Marx and Engels first thought that that would take place, because it was where capitalism was creating the industrial proletariat, putting them together in factories. And the idea would be that they could, um, that they could take their proximity with each other, organize together, and overthrow the system, right? And most often, and this is something you find within the Marxist tradition later on, Lenin and Mao, right, is they recognize that when we analyze our struggles where we are, one, revolutions can come at the weakest links in the capitalist chain as opposed to sometimes the strongest ones. But they also, the role of the peasantry can be a very critical question, and their involvement can be very critical for revolutionary struggles, right? So, like, I say that to say that's a question that's taken up by people within the Marxist tradition, which is a very huge tradition with all kinds of arguments and different positions and stuff like that. And Robinson's looking at that not from within it, right? And I think that's an important point to make is, um, Robinson did not define himself as a Marxist, and he did write critiques of Marxism. And I think those two things, for a lot of Marxists, that and the fact, I think that he's a Black man, right? Those three things together make a lot of particularly white Marxists, particularly those who, um, as Arun joked, the Brooklyn group. But I mean, it's not just that. It's people who, as Robinson is critiquing through Black Marxism, it's a lot of times people where they want to subsume or make secondary questions around race, gender, etc., and say, yeah, we all just need to come together and unify and overthrow this thing. And like, I agree that we do need to all come together and unify and overthrow this thing, but those things are critically important to how we are able to do that. And so we'll talk more about that, but I just wanted to frame that conversation up front a little bit, because this is it's a debate. And unfortunately, I think the one thing I want to add is that it's not a debate that takes place um, in a very generous or well-read fashion, right? Um, One of the things I think you could critique Robinson for in pieces is that sometimes he picks out something from from Marx's writing, right? Which again, similarly, I mean, even bigger, even more writing than Robinson, but both of them have massive amounts of work that they created, and they changed positions on things over time. They realized things, right? They came to new conclusions. They analyzed new things that were happening, and they changed their thinking around things, right? Um, and uh, and doing that, then deepened, and then other people come to the tradition and they pick up the tools of the tradition and they deepen it, right? And I think that you can see that in Robinson's work as well, which is part of why they're saying read Forgeries of Memory and Meaning. It's the last major book project that he put together, right? Um, and so often people focus on Black Marxism, which was one of the first. It wasn't the very first. Terms of Order was his PhD thesis turned into a book, but or dissertation. But it was, I think, the second, and it might have been, I think it was the first book that was published by him, right? 80, 82, 81, somewhere in there, 83 maybe. Um, and so, one, it's important to contextualize that book within the moment, but also to understand that Robinson kept writing about a lot of different things, and you can see developments of his thinking too along the way. And so I don't think it's fair to take either, nor do I think it's very scientific, right? To take either of their work and just pull out individual lines that you like or don't like. We can do that with any of them, right? It's really a question of, do they have a set of tools that's useful for struggle? And I think that they both do. And even with those tools, I think one of the things that Robinson shows us with the anthropology of Marxism is that we should actually also interrogate the tools and see if the way that, for instance, a process like historical materialism might be laid out does need to be, um, altered slightly or re-examined, or we need to think about some of the working assumptions that we have into a process like that before we could actually use it to analyze things. And I think that's the interesting part too, because there's a lot of debate too. People will say, I mean, there was the comment about Avery Gordon saying that Robinson uses historical materialism to debunk Marx's historical materialism. There's Stephen Osuna in that conversation saying Robinson is using his own form of historical materialism. And I think if you read, I mean, I've always felt that there is historical materialism within Robinson's work. Um, but it's interesting because the tension around that term, I think, in part has to do with the fact that Robinson didn't fully agree with how that practice was always done, right? And it has to do with some of the assumptions that he felt Marx inherited, right, from some of the scholars, Hegel, others, right, that he used to develop the dialectical materialist process, right? And so that's something I want to have a further conversation about at some time, to delve into more and more about kind of the book, The Anthropology of Marxism. Um, but I did want to say that I will take questions if folks have them. Again, I just want to say I'm very grateful and thankful. And I will say most of the future discussion we're going to have about this conference is not going to have to do with Black Marxism, because I do want to honor all of the other stuff um, that Cedric Robinson and Elizabeth Robinson contributed. And I do think that there's a way. I will say this is something Stephen alluded to too. That, and it brought up a few times in the conference, like the term racial capitalism is used in all kinds of ways. It's just thrown into academic scholarship nowadays as like this term that's like, oh yeah, racial capitalism, right? And um that's pretty lazy. And also, Cedric Robinson didn't even do a very like systemic way of providing like, this is exactly what racial capitalism is and exactly how it functions, right? He doesn't do, there's no Marx wrote Capital, right? There is no racial capital. There is no book that's written, right, that like fully articulates this thing. And so I think it is dangerous. And I've used the term, but I think it's dangerous to just use that term and not attempt to explain it, or not rely on somebody's work who really articulates it as a full kind of process. Um, and a lot of people use it to, as Stephen said, people will read Black Marxism and say, "Oh, I don't need to read Marx because I've read Black Marxism, and that's, you can't do that. Like, if you read Black Marxism, one thing you note is that Cedric Robinson read a lot of Marx, like a lot. Like, even if he's disagreeing with certain things, like, it's done from a place of like intense knowledge and respect for the thing that he's critiquing, right? And it's not like, that's the thing we have to learn, is like critique is not dismissal, right? And it's I think it's actually dangerous to just read Black Marxism and then say, like, I'm not going to engage with the Marxist tradition, because I think and I actually think Cedric Robinson would think that that's really dangerous too. Um, because he really cared about revolutionary theory. And I mean, that was something that came up. There was like a video shown from one of his lectures, and the Anthropology of Marxism was a course reader, right, for one of his classes. I mean, this is a person who was teaching and thinking about revolutionary theory with students all the time. And you can't just not include Marxism within, what this body of stuff that we call revolutionary theory. So, saying that, I also think, again, the Black radical tradition is another term that it gets used a lot. It becomes this brand, and some people, I mean, Josh Myers has said it's not a list, right? And it's not just the three thinkers at the end of the book, right? It's not what Robinson meant by that. And again, like, this is the thing, is like, that's not Robinson's fault, but these terms become sort of academic brands, and or even operate within popular culture sometimes, and they're not connected to like rigorous study and analysis when people use them in those ways very often, right? And so, I don't want to discourage people from using either one, but I do think that there needs to be more work actually working with Robinson's body of work, his archive, the things that are unpublished, which people will, now be able to have more access to, because a lot of stuff's going to be digitized as part of the archive, which I'll really look forward to. Um, to really kind of try to systematize and understand some of his approaches to doing the kind of scholarship that he did. And I think you see that most through, at this point, through the legacy of the people that get called Cedric's people by Erica Edwards. Um, there's another term that Fred Moten used at one point, Robinsonians, which I want to kind of think about a little bit more later on. So we'll be bringing some of those folks on, and I think we have had several of them on over the years too. I mean, we've had Stephen Osuna on the show, we've had Damian Sojourner on the show. I did an interview with Shauna Redman and Damian Sojourner while I was out there. Um, there's Tiffany Willoughby Herrard, who folks might recognize from, they were arrested, I think, at the UC Irvine encampment, if I'm not mistaken, a few weeks ago, and went viral with that video of sort of, I'm paraphrasing, but something along the lines of like, what good is a university if my students don't have a future, right? Tiffany was at the conference and was a part of several of the panels, was a part of organizing the 2004 conference for Cedric, and um, really amazing scholar, and had so many amazing reflections of different kinds. Like, every presentation that they gave was just phenomenal, but all different from each other too. And so those are just a couple of people, but there's so many. And I hope that we can show some of that in coming weeks as we talk about it. If there are any final questions, speak now or forever hold your peace, or at least until the next time we do a live. We will be back. I may do something tomorrow. I haven't decided yet. Thursday, we're going to have Joshua Mufawad Paul to talk about a piece that he wrote in the journal Material, the second issue of Material, which just came out, which is on national liberation, includes an interview with Abdul Jawad Omar as well. But Josh's piece is about, I think it's called The Eminent Garrison, and it's about settler ideology in both the United States, Canada, settler colonies in general, but also it talks about how we can see it very much reflected, obviously, right now in Palestine, of course. but so we'll have a conversation about that I'm looking forward to. And yeah, we're gonna have more stuff on the conference. I'll make sure to get something together. Probably the next one I will do will be, if I can sort the audio out, because it's a little bit there was like bells ringing throughout it or whatever. But with Damien Sojourner and Shauna Redman, and we'll probably continue that. And their presentations were phenomenal and really, like, they incorporated music, history, the blues, gospel, and I think it was a really good demonstration of both the influence of Cedric Robinson, but also Clyde Woods, but also of, you can see all the radical political economy and everything else in there as well too, right? So it gives a good sense, I think, of um, what we might start to think of as the tradition of scholars that are in Cedric Robinson and Elizabeth Robinson's lineage. And there's more I want to say about Elizabeth Robinson too. I want to talk more about the media work. Um, there was a really great presentation, and I'm forgetting the scholar's name, but I'm hoping that we can have her on. Sophie was her first name. Um, who did a great discussion about South African anti-apartheid African activists who like created their own, encrypted network before the internet, through, you know, using a flight attendant and all kinds of stuff. And it was just a really cool presentation and discussion about technology and movements and surveillance, right? And how do we circumvent these things in radical struggles to actually be more effective and covert as we're struggling, and not always be wide open to the state, to the surveillance from social media and things like this. And so that was really cool to hear Sophie's presentation, and that is connected very much to, in my view, and I think in hers as well, to the legacy of the work of Elizabeth Robinson as well as Cedric. So anyway, there's more I could say, but I will leave it there for today. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you all again very soon. If not tomorrow, then Thursday for sure.